Welcome to Face to Face. For the Newsfirst team, I'm Niresh Eliathambi. Now, we've had a government in office for a couple of months, and we expect a lot from it. But it's only the beginning. At the moment, we've had Parliament in session just for a few days, and we know that a lot more has to be done where the laws are concerned, all those acts of Parliament which govern our lives. And we have heard endless excuses from all political parties that we need new laws for this and new laws for that. But now we have a Parliament with one party having a two-thirds majority, and we can expect a lot more progress quite quickly. And to discuss all this, we have with us this evening Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu, Executive Director of the Centre for Policy Alternatives, who is, of course, no stranger to you, our viewers. Welcome, Dr. Saravanamuttu, or Dr. Sara, as you are known to all of us. So, Dr. Sara, what do we expect in terms of new laws, new acts of Parliament, in order to get this show on the road, to do all these wonderful things that the NPP promised us before the elections?
Well, Andhra Kumari Dissanayake has been president since the presidential election was on the 21st of September. Parliament was elected on the 14th of November. So I guess the argument that it is still early days and you need to give them a little bit more time does have some merit. However, what I would have liked to have seen is a very clear-cut 100-day program where they would have prioritized what government needs to do, and they hit the road running with regard to that. And that could have included new laws, amendments to laws, and actually implementing the laws that we have. And this is a problem, is that, in terms of the laws that we have, implementation-wise, the one law that has been used, of course, is the Prevention of Terrorism Act.
Indeed, that was quite a surprise to all of us, wasn't it? Because the NPP ran on a platform which included repealing the PTA, which we all know was used quite heavily against the JVP in 88-89, and of course against other parties since then. So we expected it to be repealed, not used at the drop of a hat.
No, exactly. But this is the thing, is that certain of those sort of anti-human rights, violative of fundamental rights legislation are handy for executives when they want to control and basically manage public expectations. Now, we promised in Geneva that we would repeal and replace the PTA. We came up with an ATA, an Anti-Terrorism Act, which was arguably worse than the original PTA.
Absolutely.
And then we said we're going to have a moratorium with regard to the use of the PTA, and none of those things have happened. And so I think we really have to get together, civil society has to get together and organize, and hold this government to account in terms of what they said during the election campaign. Now, certain things they might turn around and say, look, once we got into government, we realized that things were different and we couldn't really implement what we promised. But they must be held to account and be forced to make those explanations if those explanations are necessary.
But were you surprised at how easily the NPP government just used this odious piece of legislation and how frivolously they used it for something which, certainly we wouldn't consider terrorism. I suppose some might consider it so, but it's basically putting something up on the internet.
In a sense, I was extremely disappointed rather than surprised, because I think when you get into government, or at least that's been the experience in Sri Lanka, you sort of fall back on fairly authoritarian laws to suit your purpose. But I was very, very disappointed that the NPP government would do that.
And if there is a moratorium put in place on the use of the PTA, do we have the legal regime that is required to control terrorist act and so on?
And we have a whole swathe of laws that are there. There is public security, there are emergency law. I mean, all of those laws are there. I don't think you need a specific PTA and the use of the PTA to control what you consider to be terrorism. But what the PTA does is that it gives you a handy, expedient way of doing all of this. And that's why I think governments cling on to it.
But what is the position now? Do you expect the government to repeal it at all during the next 5 years, or is it your opinion that they might hang on to it throughout their tenure?
Well, good question. I think civil society and indeed the opposition, such as there is an opposition at the present moment, we need to put pressure on the government to repeal it and replace it with something else, but definitely get rid of it. Otherwise, I don't think there's going to be any sort of sense of urgency that the government would feel with regard to it. Because remember, look, if this government suddenly if it loses its blush, as it were, and everything goes pear-shaped, they will want to rely on something like the PTA to control the population. And with that huge majority that they have, they don't need to worry about anything in terms of control.
Is it that huge majority, that supermajority that they have in Parliament, which may have lulled this government into complacency?
Well, it may well have, but I tell you, in terms of any kind of opposition or pushback to this government, it's going to come from within their ranks, because it's such a large majority, and controlling a large majority is not easy, and it's not just in Sri Lanka but elsewhere as well. So there will be factions within it, perhaps those who may be closer to the JVP of 88-89 could be one faction. There will be the NPP faction, which people are led to believe are the more moderate and technocratic out of the lot. There could be a clash of interests to a certain extent. So it's the management of that majority that is a major challenge to this government. But I think, and I firmly believe, that the pushback to the government will come from within its ranks.
Now, you mentioned the need for a 100-day plan. What would you like to see in that plan in terms of laws, odious laws being repealed, and new acts, new bills being presented to Parliament to enhance the legal regime?
Perhaps everyone doesn't see this to be the case, but if we are going to redraft our social contract, we need a new constitution. We need the abolition of the executive presidency. We need a second chamber. We need, a change of the electoral system to make it more representative and to facilitate the actual participation of women. Then in addition to that, there are the lower hanging fruit of restructuring the Aegis Office. The Attorney General's office advises the government, represents the government in court, and also is the agency which brings in prosecutions. We need to remove the prosecution part of it and set up an Office of Public Prosecution. So those are things that can be done without too much effort. And indeed, whatever this government wants to do, it will get through, given that it has a 159-seat majority. And the point I would like to make, though, is this, is that, in political terms, if you are going to have to take unpopular decisions, then it's best that you take them in the early part of your administration when you kind of enjoy something of a honeymoon. And so that's why this first 100 days number has come out. So I think the government needs to sit down and prioritize what it wants to do and tell us how it's going to do it.
Now, Dr. Sara, in terms of actually carrying out an anti-corruption program, of course, a lot of voters may have expected that the NPP comes in and locks up the whole bunch of ministers from the last regime and the previous one and so on. but it doesn't quite work that way. Sri Lankan justice takes a very, very long time, and it seems to depend on political will rather than the actual judges, the AG's department, and so on. How do we change this culture?
Well, the NPP manifesto talked about setting up a special court, a 3-judge court, to deal with issues of corruption, and that has yet to happen. And I think that needs to happen fairly fast. Secondly, the point about bringing cases to court, and I've said this before, is that you have to have evidence which will stand up to scrutiny as far as the due process of the law is concerned. Now, if the government feels that it is facing political pressure in order to conclude cases, etc., they might think of going to an extrajudicial mechanism, which is extremely dangerous, because that will be followed by its successors as a way of going after their opponents and all of that. So, I mean, I think they have to also think creatively. I always sort of think of this example from the 1930s, I think, in the United States, when you had the famous criminal, Al Capone.
Al Capone.
And what did they get Al Capone on? Income tax. Why not think creatively in terms of the wealth that people have amassed? Because the wealth that has been taken outside of this country is going to take a lifetime or more to get back. But surely there are other ways in questioning and finding out how people acquired X, Y, and Z.
Well, absolutely. I mean, when you look around Colombo, you see all kinds of luxury vehicles, and I'm not even talking about the big 4-wheel drives. You suddenly see a Porsche or,
No, and there are politicians who've never had a job who have Porsches and all of that.
Exactly. So, it's so easy to spot. But as you said, nobody is asking them where they got their money.
Where they got their money.
Whereas if you and I take 10,000 rupees to the bank, we are asked by the teller, which is
due diligence and all of that.
His or her job to ask us, where did you get these funds?
Yeah.
Do you see this kind of
No, so this is the thing.
disconnect?
I mean, there has to be absolute firm direction from the highest political authorities that this is a priority and that it should be treated as such.
Now, we've spoken about the possibility of a special public prosecutor, and this is something that many political parties actually spoke about before the campaign, because the AG's department is, well, its performance is abysmal. So a lot of parties said, let's have a separate special public prosecutor, an independent one. How fast do you think that could be set up? I mean, is that something which would take years? I would think that, it's a government department. Can't you set it up within 3 or 4 months?
Absolutely. I don't see as to why it can't be set up in 2 or 3 months, as you point out, or even less. There isn't a problem with regard to a majority as far as Parliament is concerned in passing a new law or whatever is required in terms of establishing this new arm of government. So that direction needs to come, and needs to come fast. I think what the government has succeeded, in a sense, in doing, it caught the temper of the Aragalaya, and it has in some way or another sort of ushered in a new political culture. And that political culture will go from anything like, you do your own supermarket shopping and you don't go around with a whole lot of security and all of that. Okay, so that finds a resonance with the public. But you can't keep doing that. It also has to be substantive policy and that change as well, because that new political culture which you have ridden on can turn around and bite you.
Absolutely.
So that's what they have to be careful about.
Yes, because while this government has done a lot in terms of the PR,
exactly,
we see, we don't see the big convoys with a dozen vehicles and so on. It's much simpler. We see ministers, the Prime Minister and so on, living a much simpler life. But then at the same time, we still see the members of the former government and the previous governments. I mean, you can take your pick over the last 30 or 40 years, and they are living the luxury life. And of course, people would query, well, why aren't these guys being prosecuted? So, of course, it's easier said than done, isn't it?
No, it is easier said than done, perhaps. But I mean, okay, let's say we give them time till February, March of next year.
How long would the Sri Lankan public actually wait? Because our voters are very fickle people.
No, you're absolutely right. And this is also something that the JVP and PP also need to take responsibility for, is that in an election campaign, you make all sorts of promises and you raise expectations particularly high. But you do know that those expectations are never going to be met. And so this is the sort of clawing back, if you like, instead of saying to people, yes, we didn't realize this, or we got information that suggested that the issue was much bigger than we thought it was, and therefore it's going to take more time. But they're the ones who built up those expectations, and so they might have to take responsibility if those expectations, contribute towards a backlash against them.
Now, we have a local government election coming up. It's been mandated by the Supreme Court. It's been promised by the NPP government itself. So would that be the litmus test? Because we probably won't have it in the first 3 months of the year, of next year. It would probably be closer to April or May. Given that the whole nomination list has to be thrown out
and new nominations called for,
and so on.
But it could be as early as January or February. I mean, in the sense of, calling for new nominations doesn't have to take a lot of time. I mean, I think for any government that has been just elected, as I said, there's going to be a honeymoon period, and they may as well capitalize on that if there are any other elections. Local government elections, I think, were largely postponed, if you like, because of the fear that the JVP would have done particularly well at the grassroots. And now that they have won the presidency and won the parliamentary election, this would give them an opportunity to consolidate their control at grassroots level. So the earlier they held those elections, the better for them, I think, politically.
But do you see any particular rush, any particular focus of the NPP to have that as soon as possible?
I can't say I have, but I think they may well come up with them sooner rather than later. I don't see any sort of clear signals that they are going to come up with them.
Now, we have several bills which the last government had been preparing, including the Proceeds of Crime Act. What happened to those? I mean, those are fairly complete. Of course, the new Minister of Justice would need to look at those again, but would they be presented to the new Parliament?
Well, we've been told that they will be presented to Parliament, and the thing is this, is that whatever was sort of outstanding business from the past Parliaments, whatever the JVP and PP government wants to bring in terms of amendments, etc., they have the majority to do so, so it shouldn't take a lot of time as such. But so the question, though, I think is this, is that how much of new legislation that they plan to bring have they actually thought about and drafted? How much of the new activities that they are going to initiate have they really thought about? Is there a plan of action apart from the basic policy statement of saying we are going to do X, Y, and Z? It's, in a sense, the how in terms of the priorities of the government and the what in terms of the substantive content of those priorities.
No,
so that, because there's a sense of that, they're a bit at sea.
No, Dr. Sara, we see now even today a secretary to one ministry, the media ministry, was appointed. So it's been a few weeks now. Do you see this as rather a slow process of appointing key people?
Well, perhaps it's slow, but I guess they want to appoint people who they trust, who they consider to be of merit. But, at another level, one could say that, look, did they not think that they were going to come into government? And if they did think so, did they not have plans in terms of particularly personnel? Are there debates within their ranks in terms of as to whether X or Y should be put in such a position or not? So those are questions I think that we need to ask in terms of that general feeling now that there is a lot of talk, but not enough action.
And do you see that translating into a bit of frustration on the part of the public?
Yes, I think that will translate into a certain amount of frustration. It's a perception at the end of the day. And then there are those who are turning around and sort of saying that, look, they promised a lot on the economic front. And they said that they were going to increase salaries, that they were going to decrease taxes and all of that kind of thing. So there is, I noticed that in social media, there is a certain criticism of the government that they're basically following Mr. Wickramasinghe's policies.
Well, in your opinion, are the policies of Mr. Wickramasinghe and the NPP government markedly different?
Well, to the extent that the JVP has been in government and they've done things, no, they're not markedly different. But the rhetoric and the promise is of major difference. And that's what remains to be seen.
And of course, we see certain cases getting expedited in court, cases which the NPP government didn't really file. There were cases which were ongoing. Do you see a bit of the judiciary being a bit bolder in carrying out their duties, or is it again a sense of perception?
Well, I think it's always going to be a sense of perception, but indeed I think the judiciary is also bought into this new notion of this new political culture, and therefore it will be seen, I think, to be acting much more independently, and one hopes so.
Absolutely. And now we see in other countries, Dr. Saras, we see justice being done in a swifter fashion. Last night I referred to, on the show, I referred to the fact that the South Korean president has been banned from going overseas simply by the anti-corruption department itself. They didn't sort of have to get
go through a whole process,
and go to court and ask for the politicians to support them or anything. It was just one stroke of a pen, and there you go. The president can't move, and the defense minister was arrested. So what's the difference between those systems and ours? Why are we so slow, and why are they so fast? We're both Asian democracies.
State system has been highly bureaucratized, and therefore it takes time. Secondly, I think it is being perverted by politicization. But the other point that I would like to make is this: yes, they move fast, and we should too. However, we must make sure that whatever we do, that we follow the due process of law, and that rights are not in any way infringed upon.
But when it appears to be delaying the process, doesn't that cause a lack of public confidence?
No, laws delays is a major problem that we have, and we need to expedite that. But at the same time, it's not that you have to have swift justice. The ends cannot always, justify the means. You have to have both.
Absolutely. We are in conversation with Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu, Executive Director of the CPA. We'll take a short commercial break now. Don't go away. We'll be right back.
A trusted place for your fixed deposit. Valuable FD, a symbol of stability.
Step away from the conventional art of storytelling. Get ready for the Newsfirst Breakfast Rundown with me, Zulfikar Farzan.
අරුයි ඉම්ලි එකතු වෙලා ඔයාගේ වෙස් මුණ ගලවපු
Welcome back to Face to Face. We are in conversation with Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu, Executive Director of the CPA. Dr. Sara, you mentioned that justice needs to take its course. You can't sort of have,
expedite it for the sake of
for the sake
popular
of just,
pressure.
And of course, we see that in authoritarian regimes, basically they arrest you and lock you away, just like that, or you just disappear, or firing squad, or whatever. So in democracies, you are supposed to have the due process and the appeals and all that. However, as a democracy here in Sri Lanka, we still seem to take far too long.
No,
and
exactly.
we've seen some examples over the past few days. I mean, I believe today or tomorrow, the Israeli Prime Minister, Benjamin Netanyahu, is on trial for corruption. I mean, he's a very authoritarian, very powerful figure, but there you have the Israeli, the Attorney General's office prosecuting him. So that's something, you can't even think of things like that happening here.
Yeah, no, as I said before, I mean, the system is heavily bureaucratized, but on top of that, if you have politicization and political interference, then that even makes it more, paralyzed in effect, because, I mean, ordinary cases take 10 years or whatever, so we have to cut through all of that, streamline the system, take on the whole question of laws, delays, and reduce the number of years that it takes to conclude a case, for example. Yeah.
But how difficult or easy is that to do? I mean, can you simply wave a magic wand, bring in new laws, new procedures, and then a couple of months down the road it sorts itself out, or it gets sorted out? Or is this process going to take years because we've had decades of misrule, basically?
No, so this is why I think, I don't think we need to spend too much time or too much of effort on a public campaign to support getting rid of laws delays, because everyone knows about it. Everyone knows about it, and everyone is absolutely shocked and appalled that to get justice in this country, you take years and years and years. So I think it's a question of then drafting the laws and treating it again as a priority and getting it through. Because, with a 159-seat majority, there is nothing that this government cannot do.
They don't even need a vote.
Well,
they just present it to Parliament, let the opposition have their say, and then it's passed. So it's as simple as that. The NPP doesn't have to spend days justifying their bills.
But both the parliamentary opposition and civil society also have to ensure that whatever they're trying to pass does pass muster in terms of fundamental rights and democratic norms and freedoms.
Absolutely. And that was a huge criticism during the last government, where civil society didn't seem to get its say as much as perhaps it should have. But this government, what's the situation with it? Has it reached out to civil society?
Well, I mean, the thing is this, is that, when you talk about civil society, it comes in all shapes and forms in terms of good, the bad, the ugly. And the general conventional wisdom of civil society is to talk about a very sort of Colombo-centric civil society. But I think the NPP-JVP are talking about a much broader civil society. When they think of civil society, much broader, and when they think of sort of the proposals that should come from civil society, etc., they might look to universities like California and universities outside of Colombo. So there is a alternative civil society, if you like, or a broader civil society that this government would want to deal with, rather than that Colombo-based or Colombo-centric civil society which has been doing the running for such a long time. In addition to that, I think the general feeling was that civil society had been too focused on civil and political rights, almost to the exclusion of economic and social rights. And I think there is now a need to show that the two cannot be really separated. One must think holistically with regard to how you pursue the two, and that there isn't a separate chamber, if you like, saying economic and social rights, and a separate chamber saying civil and political rights. The two go together.
But when you think of civil society, you do think of Colombo-based institutions, whether it is the universities or institutions such as CPA and so on, which of course play a major role in shaping not just laws but policies,
setting the agenda.
Yes, but do you see a strong set of civil society institutions outside of Colombo which could participate? I mean, everybody. I mean, there's no naysaying this. They need to participate. But do you see such institutions outside?
Well, I mean, as a consequence of the new political culture, perhaps the trade unions might start becoming more assertive as far as the sort of general, broadly speaking, civil society role is concerned. But you're right in that insofar as you're looking, if the government is looking or is acknowledging a civil society that is outside of Colombo, this whole question of working for the government or working with the government does arise. And so therefore, the question of the independence of that civil society, the extent to which they will be seen to be too closely identified with the government, also raises questions.
Now, you mentioned the unions, but by and large, we've seen unions when it was a previous regime or any of the previous regimes, the unions were heavily dominated by the JVP or NPP. And now that the NPP is in office, where do you see the unions playing their role? Because would they be just as vociferous, or would they be hands off?
No, that's an interesting question, because I think that'll depend very much on the type of union and the type of union leaders. Because I think there will be some who will sort of turn around and say, look, this is not what we stood for in the election. We are different from the sort of ancien regime, and therefore we need to take a very different position on these policies. So I think you will get a sort of variety of responses in terms of how the unions will actually act. I think when it comes to, I mean, Tilvin Silvas talks about this government being a leftist, progressive, democratic government. So if they deviate from that sort of framework, then I think the unions too will have to act.
As far as that democratic spectrum goes, any surprises now that they are in office? Do they seem a bit more center than far, further to the left as was expected?
Yes, I think they rebranded themselves. And the rebranding, I think the purpose of the rebranding was to disassociate themselves or jettison the baggage that they had from the past, 88, 89, and this notion that they were a party of the left. So what you have is a pragmatism, and I think Anurakumara Dissanayake embodies the pragmatism in that he does what he says is necessary rather than operating from a left position or a right position. He's not an ideologue in that respect. So as far as that is tenable, that's fine. But I think there could well be issues on which they will have to take a stand in terms of left or right, and where the pragmatism may not be able to serve them to the extent that they hope.
Now, Dr. Sara, the so-called national question, with all the confusion that has been surrounding it over the decades, the 13th Amendment, the Lanka Accord, Indian government's viewpoints, Tamil Nadu government viewpoints, and so on. Now our president is about to visit India. What can we expect out of this? What would the Indian government be pushing for? What are their priorities and what are our priorities?
Well, our government has said that until a new constitution is brought in, that they will respect provincial councils and the 13th Amendment. With regard to the 13th Amendment and land rights and police powers, different people within the government have been saying different things. So it's a question of what priority they will give to constitutional reform, and within the constitutional reform ambit to a resolution of the national issue. Beyond that, I don't think that there will be issues as such on the national question, because the JVP, NPP will turn around and say, look, despite all of this, people in Jaffna, for example, voted for us. So there is a certain, I think, certain element that says, look, the best way towards reconciliation is through economic development. But now that's the area, I think, where potential conflicts or combustion can come about, if you like. Whereas, in terms of external assistance for development and all of that, in the north, it will come from India. And it'll probably come from in southern India will become, as it is at the present moment, very much the engine, the motor of growth in India. And as India's growth increases and all of that, so will the south. Now the north of Sri Lanka will be drawn into that orbit. Already you have people getting all excited and saying, look, why do they want a land link? Is it because it makes it easier for an army to come? Surely that's the only reason. Why? Is that going to be the position? That they want to invade us, they want to gobble us up, that economic sovereignty will be lost. Are we going to turn our backs on that? I mean, can we afford to do that? If the Indian economy is sort of booming ahead, we must be part of all of that. No?
Well, what's the point of being just a few kilometers off the Indian coast if we can't get there?
No, exactly. Exactly. So, those are questions, I think, that this government may well have to deal with. And also, at the same time, our foreign policy, in a sense, we can't go against India. We can't cross India. But we need to maintain our independence and autonomy. So we need to be very clear in terms of what lines can and cannot be crossed. Also, that has a particular relevance, I think, when it comes to trade. Do we have the requisite competence, caliber of the individuals who are dealing with trade issues, the competence, the information and all of that to actually deal with the Indians across the table with regard to ECTA? Is there a total mismatch in terms of the Indian trade delegation's competences and ours? So we need to look at those things. In the past, we did have that competence. When you think about the 1970s and all of that, we did have that competence. Do we still have that? Is a question that I would ask.
Well, that's true of our government, our policymakers, in regard to any other country. I mean, when we had discussions with Singapore, there were a lot of misgivings that the Singaporeans had their way and we signed whatever.
Yeah.
And the
So this
same
is the-
goes
yeah.
with Thailand, with China, and so on.
So the government then has to sort of recognize that we have a skills deficit and go outside of the public service and get people who can bridge that gap.
Well, it remains to be seen who's going to be appointed to all these posts, because the appointments, as we spoke earlier, have been going slow. But is that a drawback in itself, that going slow?
Well, in terms of appointments, yes, in so far as there's so much to be done, and the sooner we get it done, the better. And so we have to get the people in place. So in that respect, yes, I think that is a bit of a drawback.
Absolutely. And as far as our foreign missions are concerned, our foreign policy, our embassies, are we strong enough? Now, in the past, we've seen many children and nephews and nieces and cousins of politicians being appointed, which has weakened our foreign service. And of course, now they've all been brought back, so they are no longer out there. But do we have sufficiently experienced people to replace them there? Not that the politicians' relatives were doing much, but how strong is our...
Well, in the immediate and short term, we have to deal with what we have. And if within the service we don't have people with sufficient competence, etc., we need to look at reforming this service and getting it up to scratch. So the initial appointments, some may well have to be from outside of the service, but it can't just be brothers and sisters and whatever of politicians, but people who actually have the competence and who merit the job concerned. So if you're going to have non-career diplomats, we need to make sure that they are the right ones in terms of the competence.
Now, we spoke of low-hanging fruit earlier. Those are the easy decisions which would yield quick results.
Yeah.
But we haven't seen a lot of that happening, have we? Now, for example, and sometimes the world outside reminds us of this, because this morning we got the news that the former CEO of Sri Lankan Airlines and former ambassador to Russia have been banned from entering the United States on the grounds of corruption, they and their family members. And then we look around and those guys are walking around Colombo. So sometimes we get these reminders.
Is that, look, that other states will act in terms of imposing travel bans, etc., will then presumably increase the pressure on the government to act and act fast in terms of dealing with accountability as far as these individuals are concerned. But yes, they are free to walk around and all of that, as you say, and something badly needs to be done about it, and therefore that prioritization, the action plan, hitting the ground, running as it were with regard to anti-corruption, has yet to happen. Now, and must happen fast.
Now, Dr. Sara, we're nearing the end of 2024, and we've got a brand new year coming up. So what would be your wish list as an important member of civil society and a long-standing one? What would be on your wish list for next year for Sri Lanka and for, obviously, for the NPP government to carry out?
Well, as I said before, I mean, that whole constitutional exercise, getting rid of the executive presidency, all of that, I think, is very definitely on that wish list. The reform of the AG's office is very definitely on the wish list, getting rid of the PTA, all of that. But I think, you know, there are some fundamental issues that the government and any government has to face. I mean, for a start, the size of the public service. We have 1.4 million people for 22 million people in this country.
It's the elephant in the room, isn't it?
And I would imagine that out of those 1.4 million, a fair amount of them voted for the NPP-HAVP. So the government has to tell its supporters a lot of the hard truths. We can't go on saying that we're not going to get rid of any of them, and then any time comes to an election, we give them a salary increase and whatever. Where is the money to come from? The other thing, of course, is that whole question of where is growth and the money to come from is something that this government has to face. So it's reduction of the public service, looking again at state-owned enterprises, maybe privatizing them, or going for public-private partnerships, demilitarization, all of those things I would like to see happen in the first 6 months of next year in terms of...
But how likely is that, Dr. Sara? I mean, let's look at the public service. We have key ministers who have come out and said nobody is going to be sent home. So how do you trim this?
Well, I think we have to then therefore come up with a pressure within civil society, a pressure in the opposition parties to face this and not sort of say, look, we're going to sustain this forever and ever, or come 2027, we'll have to go for another IMF deal, and it's probably going to have to be tougher.
Now, Dr. Sara, a few months ago, I interviewed a young lady from Australia who was an expert in reskilling. That was her company's role. They were hired by government and local government authorities in Australia, and also private companies, which needed to basically trim the fat and move people around, and so they needed to give them new skills. Now, would that work in Sri Lanka? Are we too entrenched?
Well, it has to work if we're going to get out of it. I mean, we're not saying, look, cut them and let them go. You have to reskill them. I mean, from the army to the public sector, in terms of the bureaucrats, etc., you have to give them another skill so that then they can go into the economy and try their luck. You know, you can't just let them go like that, but you need to start thinking and have a plan in how you're going to proceed with this. I mean, I always thought that, for example, when the war ended in 2009, the government should have come up with something like a GI Bill, which let those people out, gave them preferential positions to get into universities, learn a skill, and then go out into the economy. But nothing like that happened. They kept them in there. And they started what? Growing and selling vegetables, running golf courses, running hotels. I mean,
it became quite a joke.
No, exactly.
But a very bad joke.
A very bad joke indeed.
We were paying for it.
Yeah.
And the successive governments didn't seem to prioritize that at all. But do you see that being prioritized by this government?
Well, I think this government might not be averse to the idea, because I think the plan was by 2030 that we would reduce them to 150,000 or something like that. So I don't think this government is going to be averse to doing that, no.
Well, it's been good to have you back on our program, Dr. Sara, and I'm afraid we are out of time. Thank you very much to Dr. Paikiasothy Saravanamuttu, Executive Director of the Center for Policy Alternatives, and thank you to you at home for watching. Don't go away, because the news is coming up next. Have a good evening.